Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged the United Nations to act and to reform its system, which assures its Security Council permanent member Russia has a veto, saying everything must be done to ensure the international body works effectively. Key points: Mr. Zelensky accused invading Russian troops of committing the most terrible war crimes since World War II. Mr. Zelensky accused invading Russian troops of committing the most terrible war crimes since World War II. Moscow denies targeting civilians, saying the horrors depicted were staged by Ukraine. Moscow denies targeting civilians, saying the horrors depicted were staged by Ukraine. Russia's invasion has been described as one of the greatest ever challenges to international order. Warning: graphic content that may disturb some readers. In a passionate address to the UN Security Council on Tuesday via video, Mr. Zelensky described, in detail, grim scenes in the Ukrainian town of Butcha, saying Moscow wanted to turn Ukraine into silent slaves. They cut off limbs, cut their throats. Women were raped and in front of their children. Their tongues were pulled out, only because their aggressor did not hear what they wanted to hear from them, the Ukrainian president said, recounting what he described as the worst atrocities since World War II. Likening the troops' actions to those of the Islamic State terrorist group, Mr. Zelensky again made a plea for international legal action for what was happening in Ukraine. The Russian military, and those who gave them orders, must be brought to justice immediately for war crimes in Ukraine, he said. Mr. Zelensky told council members that civilians had been shot in the back of the head after being tortured, they had been blown up with grenades in their apartments, and crushed by tanks while in cars. The Security Council needed to make decisions for peace in Ukraine, he said. If you do not know how to make this decision, you can do two things: remove Russia as an aggressor and a source of war so it cannot block decisions about its own aggression. Or the other option is please show we can reform or change, dissolve yourself and work for peace, he said. If there is no alternative and no option, then the next option would be dissolve yourself altogether. And I know that you can admit that if there is nothing that you can do besides conversation, we need peace. The Ukrainian leader made his plea as grisly evidence continued to emerge of civilian acts carried out by Russian forces on the outskirts of Kiev. Volodymyr Zelensky stressed that Butcha was only one place and there are more with similar horrors elsewhere. Mr. Zelensky showed the UN's most powerful body brief video footage of bloody corpses that ended with the words "Stop Russian aggression." He also told the Security Council there was not a single crime that Russian troops had not committed in Butcha. The Russian military searched for, and purposefully, anyone who served our country. They shot women outside their houses when they just tried to call someone who is alive. Their entire families, adults and children, and they tried to burn the bodies, he said. Between 150 and 300 bodies may be in a mass grave by a church in the town of Butcha, Ukrainian human rights ombudswoman Lyudmila Denisova said. Reiterating what the Kremlin has been saying for days, Moscow's UN ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, denied Russian troops targeted civilians and said the horrors depicted had been staged by the Ukrainians. You only saw what they showed you, he said. The only ones who would fall for this are Western dilettantes. He said that while Butcha was under Russian control, not a single civilian suffered from any kind of violence. China's UN ambassador told Tuesday's session that the reports and images showing civilian deaths in Butcha were very disturbing, but added that the circumstances should be verified and any accusations should be based on facts. Ambassador Zhong Jun also urged the United States, NATO and the European Union to engage in a dialogue with Russia rather than pursue further sanctions that, he said, were not effective in solving the crisis. The White House said the US shares frustration that Russia is part of the Security Council, but does not see Russia's membership on the Council changing. A new round of US sanctions that will be imposed on Russia will in part be a response to ings in the Ukrainian town of Butcha, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said on Tuesday, local time. The sanctions will target Russian government officials, their family members, Russian-owned financial institutions, also state-owned enterprises, she said. A move to keep the Russian government from using funds held in US accounts to make payments to service its debt is aimed at forcing the Kremlin to choose between default and draining its remaining dollar reserves, she added. Her comments come after the US Treasury Department also imposed sanctions on a prominent Russia-based darknet market site, Hydra, and a cryptocurrency exchange, Garantex, that it said operates primarily out of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The sanctions send a message today to criminals that you cannot hide on the darknet or their forums, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said. Loading. Russia's invasion, one of the greatest challenges ever to international order, UN says. UN Political Affairs Chief Rosemary DiCarlo said the United Nations had received credible allegations that Russian forces have used cluster munitions in populated areas at least 24 times. She said allegations that Ukrainian forces have used such weapons were also being investigated. Allegations of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces have also emerged. These include gang rape and rapes in front of children, she said. There are also claims of sexual violence by Ukrainian forces and civil defense militias. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke via remote feed during a meeting of the UN Security Council. She said the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine was seeking to verify all allegations. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned the Security Council that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is one of the greatest challenges ever to the international order because of its nature, intensity, and consequences. Mr. Guterres said the war was putting even more pressure on the developing world, with more than 1.2 billion people particularly vulnerable to spiking food, energy, and fertilizer costs. We are already seeing some countries move from vulnerability into crisis, and signs of serious social unrest, he added. AP